Previously, on Mafia Boss's 200 men surrounded the clinic when he found out what her abusive ex did. Irene Flores's life had been shattered. Abused by her ex-husband Levi, she fought for her life in a hospital bed, only to awaken to a new, terrifying reality. Benjamin Parrish, a quiet yet intimidating regular at her coffee shop, had orchestrated her rescue. Surrounded by the sheer force of his mafia empire, Irene learned that her survival came at a cost. She was no longer just a woman trying to escape her past. She was now under the protection of the most powerful man in the state, a man whose obsession with her was both terrifying and strangely comforting. Now, 3 months after Benjamin Parrish saved her life, Irene Flores discovered something she never expected. She was happy. Not the cautious, fragile happiness of someone waiting for the next disaster, but genuine, surprising joy that bloomed in the quiet moments of her rebuilt life. Flores's coffee thrived under her care. The nightmares that once shattered her sleep had faded to distant memories, and the dangerous crime boss who'd terrified her in that hospital room now made her laugh when he tried and failed spectacularly to cook pasta in her tiny kitchen. Ben's visits had evolved from protective surveillance to something that made her heart race with anticipation. He was shockingly terrible at being normal, hilariously out of place among her modest furniture and thrift store decor, and surprisingly tender when he thought no one was watching. She'd learned that the mafia boss wasn't just the monster of legend. He was also a man who remembered exactly how she took her coffee, who sent her rare first edition books he thought she'd enjoy, and who looked at her like she was the only real, solid thing in his carefully controlled universe. When you're loved by the most powerful man in the state, that love makes you visible. And visibility, in Ben's world, meant vulnerability. When a business rival noticed that Benjamin Parrish, the untouchable mafia boss who'd built an empire on calculated ruthlessness, had finally found something that made him human, everything changed. Before we continue, tell us where you're watching from, and if you're enjoying Irene's journey, make sure you're subscribed, because this story is about to take you somewhere unexpected. Now, let's dive back in. The Tuesday afternoon sun streamed through the windows of Flores's coffee, casting golden rectangles across the worn wooden floors. Irene wiped down the counter, smiling at the familiar rhythm of her work. The hiss of the espresso machine, the gentle murmur of conversation, the comforting aroma of fresh ground coffee beans. 3 months had passed since St. Mary's Hospital. 3 months since her world had shattered and been rebuilt into something entirely different. 3 months since Benjamin Parrish had walked into her life and refused to leave. The bell above the door chimed, and Irene didn't need to look up to know who'd arrived. She felt his presence the way you feel a change in air pressure before a storm. Electric, inevitable, overwhelming. "Black coffee, no sugar," she called out, already reaching for a cup. "You're showing off," Ben's deep voice carried across the shop, warm with amusement. She turned to face him, and her breath still caught despite seeing him nearly every day. He wore one of his impeccably tailored dark suits, the kind that probably cost more than 3 months of her rent, and he looked absurdly out of place among the mismatched vintage chairs and student laptops. But his sharp blue eyes were fixed on her with an intensity that made her feel like the only person in the world. "I'm not showing off," Irene replied, walking his coffee to his usual corner booth. "I'm being efficient. You've ordered the same thing every single day for 6 months. Consistency is a virtue," Ben said solemnly, though his mouth twitched with suppressed humor. "Consistency is boring," she countered, sliding into the seat across from him, something she'd started doing during slow afternoons, much to the fascination of her regular customers. Ben reached across the table, his large hand engulfing hers. The casual intimacy of the gesture still thrilled her. "Then I'm boring, as long as it brings me here." "Smooth," Irene teased, but she didn't pull her hand away. Did Vincent teach you that line? At the mention of his elderly advisor, Ben's expression shifted to genuine embarrassment. Vincent's romantic advice involves quoting Italian poetry and suggesting I serenade you under your window. Irene burst out laughing, drawing curious glances from nearby tables. Please tell me you didn't actually consider that. I considered everything, Ben admitted, his thumb tracing circles on her palm. I asked the team what normal people do on dates. One of them suggested bowling. Bowling? Irene couldn't contain her grin. Your terrifying enforcer who I've seen intimidate grown men with a look suggested bowling? He claims it's democratic. Everyone's equally bad at it, apparently. Ben's expression was so earnestly confused that Irene's heart melted. I don't understand the appeal of throwing heavy balls at pins, but if you'd like to try it. Ben, Irene interrupted gently, squeezing his hand. We don't have to do normal couple things. We're not a normal couple. Something vulnerable flashed across his face. Does that bother you? She considered the question seriously. 3 months ago, the answer would have been yes. Everything about their situation was irregular, dangerous, morally complicated. But somewhere between his daily coffee shop visits and the late-night conversations in her apartment, between his terrible cooking attempts and the way he listened to her dreams with complete attention, she'd stopped trying to fit them into a conventional box. No, she said honestly. It doesn't bother me. I like what we have. The relief in Ben's eyes was palpable. He raised her hand to his lips, pressing a kiss to her knuckles with old-fashioned gallantry that made her blush. Several of her regular customers were watching them with undisguised interest, but Irene found she didn't care. 2 weeks after their conversation in the coffee shop, Irene stood in Ben's penthouse office, staring at a wall-sized screen displaying what looked like a corporate organizational chart. Except instead of typical business divisions, the chart showed territories, operations, and alliance networks that made up the intricate web of Ben's empire. This is the Kozlov organization, one of Ben's lieutenants explained, using a laser pointer to highlight a section of the map. His tone was professional, almost academic, as if he were briefing a new executive rather than explaining criminal operations to a coffee shop owner. Irene had been surprised when Ben invited her to this meeting. Even more surprised when his inner circle had greeted her arrival with professional warmth, as if her presence in their inner sanctum was perfectly natural. They're not enemies, Vincent clarified from his seat at the conference table. They're competitors. There's a difference. Enemies want to destroy you, Kara added, not looking up from her tablet. Competitors just want what you have. And what do they want? Irene asked, settling into a chair next to Ben. Ben's expression was carefully neutral, but she'd learned to read the subtle tension in his jaw that indicated stress. Access to my port facilities. I control 60% of the shipping infrastructure in this region. They want a larger share. So it's a business dispute, Irene said slowly. It's always a business dispute, Vincent said, with the weary wisdom of someone who'd seen decades of conflicts. The violence usually comes when people forget that and make it personal. The lieutenant pulled up another screen, this one showing photographs of several men. The Kozlov family is run by Dmitry Kozlov. He's smart, ruthless when necessary, but generally prefers negotiation to violence. His brother Alexei is more volatile. There's been tension recently. What kind of tension? Irene leaned forward, genuinely interested despite the subject matter. Alexei thinks his brother is too soft, Ben explained. He's been pushing for more aggressive expansion, including moves that would directly challenge our operations. And this concerns me because, Irene asked, though she suspected she knew the answer. Kara finally looked up, her sharp eyes assessing. Because they've noticed you. They've documented your relationship with Ben, identified you as potentially significant, and Alexei has suggested using that information as leverage. Irene's stomach dropped. Leverage how? Nothing violent, Ben said quickly, his hand finding hers under the table. They're not stupid enough to physically threaten you, but Alexei has connections in law enforcement. He's been making noise about exposing your relationship to federal prosecutors, suggesting you might be an accessory to my various activities. But I'm not, Irene started. You're not, Vincent confirmed. But perception matters. An investigation would be disruptive, invasive, and potentially damaging even if it goes nowhere. It's a form of pressure. Irene absorbed this information, feeling a chill despite the warm office. This was the reality of Ben's world. Threats that came through legal channels, weapons that looked like court documents, battles fought with lawyers instead of guns. What are our options, she asked, surprising herself with the use of our. The lieutenant raised an eyebrow but looked approving. Traditionally, we'd increase pressure on their operations, make their business expensive and difficult, force them to back down. Which works, Kara added. But it's costly for everyone and risks escalation. What's the alternative? Irene asked. Ben squeezed her hand. We negotiate. Find a solution that gives them something they want without compromising what we need. But that's not how these things usually work in your world, is it? Irene observed. No, Vincent admitted. Usually it's about dominance, proving you can't be pushed, but dominance games have costs. Irene stood, moving to examine the organizational chart more closely. Everyone watched her, waiting. She could feel the weight of their attention. These dangerous, powerful people who ran a criminal empire were actually interested in what a coffee shop owner had to say. What specifically do they need from your port facilities? She asked. The lieutenant pulled up another document. Regular shipping access for their import operations. Currently, they're using facilities 200 miles south, which adds significant time and cost to their logistics. And you won't give them access because? Because giving them access means losing control, Ben explained. Once they're embedded in my infrastructure, they can observe my operations, identify vulnerabilities, potentially disrupt my business. What if you didn't give them access? Irene suggested. What if you leased them access, at market rates with very specific terms and restrictions? The room went quiet. Explain, Vincent said, leaning forward with interest. Irene warmed to her topic, the analytical part of her brain that managed inventory and vendor relationships kicking into gear. They don't need to own part of your operation. They need access to infrastructure. That's a service you can provide for a fee. You maintain complete control of your facilities, they get the efficiency they need, and everyone profits. They'd never accept market rates, the lieutenant objected. They'd want preferential treatment. Then give them a competitive rate, Irene countered. Not preferential, but reasonable. The goal isn't to maximize profit on this one deal. The goal is to de-escalate conflict and establish a precedent for business relationship over territorial warfare. Ben was staring at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. You're suggesting we treat them as clients rather than rivals. Why not? Irene turned to face the room. You have infrastructure they need. That's an asset. Use it to create revenue and peace instead of just defending it and inviting conflict. Kara's lips curved into something almost like a smile. She's got a point. We've been so focused on the territorial aspect that we missed the simple business opportunity. Vincent laughed, the sound delighted and surprised. Ben, where did you find her? She found me, Ben replied, his eyes still on Irene. In a coffee shop, being extremely unimpressed by my dramatic entrance. The restaurant Dmitry Kozlov chose for their meeting was upscale Italian, the kind of place where the menu had no prices and the sommelier wore white gloves. Irene recognized it as neutral territory, expensive enough to demonstrate respect, public enough to ensure safety. She sat in Ben's car outside, smoothing her tailored gray dress nervously. What if I mess this up? Ben, looking devastatingly handsome in a dark suit, took her hand. You won't. But even if you did, I'd be there to support you. This is a negotiation, not a test. Feels like a test, Irene muttered. Then you're already winning, the driver said from the front seat. Dimitri agreed to meet with you, a woman he's never dealt with, who has no official role in our organization. That means he's curious. Curiosity is opportunity. Kara's voice came through the earpiece Irene wore, tiny and unobtrusive. Remember, you're not asking for anything. You're offering a solution to a mutual problem. That's a position of strength, not weakness. Irene took a deep breath, centering herself. She'd spent the past week preparing for this meeting, researching the Kozlov organization, studying similar deals Ben had made, role-playing negotiations until her head spun. She was as ready as she'd ever be. "Let's do this," she said with more confidence than she felt. They entered the restaurant together, but the plan was for Irene to meet with Dmitri semi-privately, while Ben sat at a nearby table, close enough for protection, but far enough to demonstrate trust. Dmitri Kozlov stood when she approached his table, and Irene was surprised by his appearance. She'd expected someone obviously criminal, dramatic, intimidating, scarred. Instead, Dmitri looked like a successful businessman in his late 40s. Well-groomed, expensive suit, intelligent eyes that assessed her with interest rather than hostility. "Ms. Flores," he greeted her in accented but perfect English. "I confess, I was intrigued by your request for this meeting." "Thank you for agreeing, Mr. Kozlov," Irene replied, accepting his handshake. His grip was firm but not aggressive, another good sign. A woman sat beside him, ethereally beautiful with dark hair and haunted eyes. "My wife, Anya," Dmitri introduced. "She insisted on accompanying me. She's curious about the woman who has captured the chairman's attention." "It's lovely to meet you," Irene said warmly, shaking Anya's hand. The other woman's grip was brief, almost trembling, and Irene filed that observation away for later. They sat, and a waiter immediately appeared with wine. The preliminary small talk was expertly handled by Dmitri, questions about her coffee shop, which he'd clearly researched, compliments on her dress, observations about the restaurant's wine selection. He was charming, sophisticated, and absolutely ruthless beneath the polish. Irene could sense it in the way he controlled the conversation, testing her responses, looking for weaknesses. "Shall we discuss business?" Dmitri finally said once the appetizers had been served. "I understand you have a proposal regarding the port facilities situation." Irene set down her fork, meeting his eyes directly. "I do, but first, I want to acknowledge that you and Mr. Parrish have different operating styles. You prefer elegant solutions to crude displays of force. So do I. I think we can find an arrangement that benefits both organizations without anyone needing to prove dominance." Dimitri's eyebrow rose slightly. "Go on." "Your organization needs reliable access to port facilities for your import operations," Irene stated. "Currently, you're using facilities 200 miles south, which adds significant time and cost. Mr. Parrish controls optimal infrastructure, but has been unwilling to grant access because it would compromise his operational security." "An accurate summary," Dmitri agreed. "What if access wasn't granted but leased?" Irene proposed. "Parrish Enterprises could offer you a commercial lease agreement for designated dock space and warehouse facilities. You'd have reliable access, we'd maintain complete operational control, and the relationship would be formalized through legitimate business channels." "At what cost?" Dmitri asked, his tone sharpening. "Market competitive rates," Irene replied smoothly. "Not preferential treatment, but fair pricing based on current commercial lease agreements in the area. I've prepared a preliminary proposal with specific terms, rates, and usage restrictions." She slid a folder across the table. Dmitri opened it, scanning the contents with focused attention. Irene had worked on this document for days, consulting with Kara on every detail. It was professional, comprehensive, and designed to appeal to a businessman's sensibility rather than power dynamics. "This is," Dmitri paused, seeming genuinely surprised. "This is a legitimate business proposal." "Because it's legitimate business," Irene confirmed. Mr. Parrish's organization operates numerous legal enterprises. This would simply be another contractual relationship. No territorial concessions, no power struggles, just two businesses entering into a mutually beneficial agreement. Dmitri looked at her with newfound respect. You're offering me exactly what I need while giving Parrish exactly what he wants. Access without vulnerability, revenue without risk. He smiled, the expression not entirely pleasant. Very clever, Miss Flores. Who really designed this proposal? I did, Irene said firmly, with input from Mr. Parrish's legal and financial teams, obviously, but the core concept is mine. Why? Dmitri asked bluntly. Why would the chairman's lover concern herself with our business dispute? Irene had prepared for this question. Because I care about him, which means I care about his organization. Because unnecessary conflict benefits no one. And because I have experience finding solutions that work for everyone, it's what I do in my own business every day. She negotiates with coffee suppliers. Anya spoke for the first time, her voice soft but clear. I read about her. She built a successful business through relationships and fair dealing. Dmitri glanced at his wife.